I always, for most of my theological career, thought that the desert was the opposite of paradise. All right, paradise was, the promised land, was to be with Christ, to have honey and milk, and to live in the land of plenty. And the desert was the place of wanting, the place of evil, actually. In the Old Testament, on the Feast of Yom Kippur, it is told that the high priest will lay hands on a goat, casting everyone's sins on the goat, and send the goat into the desert. And so I've always kind of thought, well, the desert, that's a place of evil. That's, it's where you suffer. But I have a new understanding now. What really is the opposite of paradise? If we think geographically, kind of using the idea, metaphor of land and even Jerusalem. Well, the opposite of the land of plenty, Israel, the promised land, is not the desert, I think today. It's exile. That is the opposite of paradise. Exile in Egypt, exile in Babylon, to be enslaved, to be in a hopeless condition, to be suffering. And the desert is not really the opposite of paradise. It actually is a passageway. It's the way to the promised land. You can't get there except going through the desert. And if ever you have traveled to the Middle East, or will someday, you will note that to go from Egypt to Israel means you have to go through Mount Sinai territory, which is total desert. And if you want to go from the east, from the Jordan, or from wherever in the Far East over to Israel, you got to cross through the Jordan Valley, and that is hot. Believe you me, Jericho, like the lowest city on the planet, 2,500 feet below sea level, it's like 120 degrees in the summer. Very hot, very desert. Now from the north, you may be able to come through the mountains, but even that is very rugged. So I would like to suggest that the desert is a pathway to paradise. In the gospel, we find St. John the Baptist, the voice crying out in the desert. Now, back in the times of the writing in Greek, as in Hebrew, they don't quite have the, if you will, the commas and the colons and the periods, the exclamation marks that we have. You don't know exactly where one sentence ends and the other begins sometimes. And the meaning could therefore be the following. A voice in the desert cries out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Or it could be, a voice cries out, "In the desert, prepare the way of the Lord." Did you catch the difference? Well, what is it? If you read the book of Isaiah, it seems to imply that the voice cries out in the wilderness, in the desert, "Prepare the way of the Lord." If you read the book Gospel of Mark, it seems to cry, the voice in the desert cries out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Seems like it's both. And in fact, I'd suggest it is. I'd suggest it is. John the Baptist, Jesus himself saying, "Come into the desert. Come into the desert. Prepare the way of the Lord." So what are we to do in the desert? Well, we are to be stripped. We are to be stripped of all false security, to be stripped of the things we cling to that keep us from God. We are to face the truth in ourselves. I mean, when you're out in silence in the desert, you got things inside that you got to face, okay? You can't just talk to cows. And I say that jokingly because I had a woman tell me she went on retreat once. She loves to talk a lot. She said she had to go out and talk to the cows just to get through the week. But in silence for many hours, you have to deal with your thoughts and your desires. You can't escape through busyness or technology or distractions. What's really in there? And we have to fight Satan. I mean, that's when the battle line is in the mind. And when we have to think, look at what we're thinking about, we're going to have to face Satan and the temptations that he does. So Christ says in this season, I want you to go in the desert. I want you to be stripped of all these things you cling to, all those things that keep you from me, because I want you to be free. The desert is a pathway. Now, it's also a place of tremendous miracles and love. I want to point this out. What happened in the desert when Israel was passing from Egypt to Israel? Miracles happened in the desert. God led them by a column of fire at night and cloud by day. He sent quail and manna in a miraculous way. He gave the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. He parted the Red Sea. He parted the Jordan. Miracles do happen in the desert. And love. The desert is where God betrothed his people. The desert is where he said, you will be my people, and I will be your God. So let's turn now to the Lord, who invites us into the desert to let go of all else that keeps us from him, to hear his invitation, to be his people in love, to see his miracles.